Welcome to Portland Cocktail Week Distance Learnings every day at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. My name is Anne-Louise Marquis. I work with Campari America, and today I am very excited to be joined by Dorothy Elizabeth. She is a chemist by training, a electronic music festival planner by fun, and a bartender, drink maker, drink thinker by profession. So today we're gonna dive into maceration and infusion with Dorothy. She looks like she's in a really beautiful place right now. I'm very jealous of your background, Dorothy.
It's real.
I know, I can tell. It looks real, it looks beautiful. And today we are sponsored by Appleton Estate Jamaica Rum. Dorothy has her old bottle. You can see she's got the signature. I have the new bottling, which you'll start to see rolling out across the country, our beautiful new bottles of Appleton Estate. And you'll see the reserve is now 8 years old. So it's now the 8 reserve, which means that with a minimum age statement, cam girl here, 8-year-old, if it says 8 on the bottle, it means that's the youngest rum that's in the bottle. So we're really excited to have this out in the market for you guys to be able to taste and try, and today for Dorothy to be mixing and infusing with. So Dorothy, please take us into what is maceration, what is infusion, what are the things that people always get wrong about this, and how can we learn to do it right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So this is a really fun class. I taught it about 2 years ago at Portland Cocktail Week, and it was a lot of fun. The biggest thing is we all have perception as to what maceration is. We typically think of like the old distillers making and macerating different liqueurs, which is totally true. And then when we think of infusions, we might think of those like semi-pretentious bartenders from like 2003 infusing strawberries into their gin and having it be revolutionary. We all have our perceptions. Some things are true, some things are not, but I'm here to primarily demystify the process, give more of a scientific bent, where we're gonna be talking about the chemistry and the physics of infusion and maceration. And then ultimately, when we think of the nature of the ingredients and following scientific processes, allowing us to break it all down and troubleshoot and allow us to become more efficient in our cocktail making. So I am going to share my screen. Where is it? Here we are. So you can see my presentation. All right, is that up? Can you see it?
Yep.
Perfect. And so when we're thinking of infusion and maceration, we are thinking about what the heck it is. And then we're gonna break down the physics and the chemistry and then applications behind the bar. When we think of WTF, what's the difference between maceration and infusion? The big thing with maceration, when we're thinking of food, we're softening and breaking down pieces of something into a liquid, AKA known as a solvent, which solvents we remember from chemistry, where we have universal solvents, where water is almost a universal solvent. We have things like acetone, which are universal solvents. In chemistry, we think it as a preparation of an extract by solvent extraction. So we have a liquid and we are breaking things down. It's the ability ultimately to dissolve other substances. So we could be working with water as our solvent, or we could be working with alcohol. In most bar settings, when we are putting our strawberries in our gin, or we're putting our vanilla bean in our rum, what we're ultimately doing is macerating it. It is cold process. We're not applying any heat to it. We are just letting it chill out and hang out. When we're thinking of alcohol, and ultimately it's not complicated. When we're thinking of maceration in liqueurs, this can take as long as a year. And when we're thinking of most macerations, it's the techniques that are traditionally used in bitters making, where we have raw materials They're soaked in alcohol until the spirit absorbs those flavors. The final product, sometimes known as a tincture, can form the basis of most liqueurs. And ultimately, if you're using different bittering agents, they can be classified as bitters. The most important thing is that maceration takes a lot longer. And we're thinking about it as a whole. It's not rocket science. Like, you do not need a PhD to macerate. It's primarily, you are just taking your materials and you are soaking them in alcohol or water or whatever your solvent may be. It is very basic, even though it can be very time consuming. When we're thinking of infusion, the biggest thing, when you're chopping up those strawberries and sitting them at the bar and throwing them in the alcohol, that's not an infusion. That's actually your maceration, like we talked about before. The biggest thing in infusion has to deal with an application of heat. And we're thinking of heat, we think of kinetic energy. And ultimately, it's the application of heat that facilitates flavor extraction. Typically, it's cheap and easy. We're thinking about it, and this is just like a basic idea of a graph. It's not anything technical. We think of our rates of flavor extraction in time, and typically we have a higher rate of extraction with an addition of heat. Maceration is no added heat, so it takes a lot longer. This is not drawn to scale, but this is just a reference. When we think of infusion, they could be sous-videing our spirits and bitters. Ultimately, when we're thinking of the physics and the chemistry of these two, it's all the same thing. And it's all diffusion. When we think of diffusion, some of you may be familiar with the term from chemistry or even from biology. We are thinking of diffusion by kinetic energy. We have some particles that we want to move from one space to another space. Hold on, I'm having trouble seeing this one. Cool. So we're thinking of diffusion, hold on, and we're thinking of kinetic application. Diffusion, ultimately, we have some sort of semi-permeable membrane, whether that's the membrane of the fruit that we're using, or whether it's any form of cell structure, whether it's a vegetable, whether it's a fruit, whether it's an herb. And then we typically have molecules on one side, and we want to move them through the other side. So an example would be if I have a raspberry and I have it coated in sugar and it's surrounded by sugar. You have a water content within the raspberry that's going to want to diffuse outward into the sugar, and you have sugar that wants to diffuse into the raspberry. A great example would be in terms of with hot and cold and how they displace one another. If I am in my hot apartment and it is sub-zero and freezing inside, and I open up the window, there's going to be a burst of cold air in and hot air out. That general idea of the transfer of one thing from one side to the other and back and forth, that's diffusion. And ultimately, that's what we're doing when we're infusing or macerating. So when we think about it in terms of alcohol, we think of a structure with our herbs and fruit, which is serving as the semi-permeable membrane, with sugars, the water content that contains flavor components, and diffuse outward into solution. So out of this picture, we think of, we have solvent in. So if I have my raspberry and alcohol, we have some alcohol soaking into the raspberry, and then we typically have sugars coming outward. And then when we think of kinetic energy as a whole and how we are trying to troubleshoot how we're using our diffusion and harnessing it, we have to think of kinetic. Kinetic is energy in motion, and there's a lot of different ways to facilitate kinetic energy. We think about it as heat. So if molecules are hot, they're moving around really fast. We could actively try moving things, so we can force them to move. We can control pressure, and we can control concentration. These are all different elements that we can use to propel our transfers of flavors. So as I said before, we can control temperature, we can control pressure, we can do equilibrium based, and then applied kinetic. So when we're thinking of our temperature, we're driving kinetic energy via increased temperature. So if I am facilitating a diffusion in my sous vide, I am adding heat. And by adding heat, I'm getting those molecules moving and allowing them to move back and forth. Higher temperatures have higher kinetic energy. This is an example. So we have low kinetic energy. We have molecules that don't want to move. So if something's really cold, then those molecules are stagnant. So this is why when you're macerating at a lower temperature, it takes a longer period of time because those molecules don't want to move as rapidly. Versus if I am applying heat, those molecules are moving aggressively, and therefore they're going to have an easier time transferring through the membrane. So we think of boiling water has a high kinetic energy versus water at low temperature has low kinetic. Also applications would be kinetic energy increases with atmospheric pressure. So with this and different ways that we can play with atmospheric pressure are more in the molecular mixology side or when we're playing with food science. So this we'll be using vacuum chambers. You can facilitate diffusion and increases in kinetic energy by using a vacuum or by increasing pressure with an ISI. We've all read Liquid Intelligence and we see how people use pressure-based ISIs with nitrogen to facilitate a spontaneous diffusion. So that's also a way that we can apply kinetic energy.
Hey, Dorothy, I don't know if everyone has read that. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So when we're thinking of pressure-based, when you're playing with pressure, you can ultimately allow different molecules to increase their boiling point. And so even though something might be cold, if I have my ISI, and which is kind of like a whipped cream charger, and if I charge it with maybe 2 small things of nitrogen, what I'm doing is increasing the overall pressure within that vessel. And when I'm increasing the pressure, we're increasing the kinetic energy because we're cramming more things together. This will allow the liquids that we're using to become more volatile, they'll become more active, and then it'll ultimately, like if I put cucumber and vodka into a ISI, I charge it. Some of those water molecules and the sugar molecules from within those cucumbers will diffuse outward into my vodka solution. Some of the vodka will diffuse into the cucumber, and ultimately I'll be left with solution that would be cucumber flavored. So that would be a good example of that. Also, the same thing goes if you're using a vacuum chamber. If you are fortunate enough to have a cryovac, if not, they have the smaller ones. If you're in New York, good luck. It costs like tens of thousands of dollars to get the licensing for it. But you can put in your ingredients, you can vac seal them together, change the amount of pressure, and then ultimately you will allow for the diffusion process to happen. So that's a general description of that one. Also, movement can happen for diffusion naturally. So will happen in wanting to attain equilibrium. I like to think of this as a great example of when we're making an oleo or an oleosaccharum, aka known as an oil sugar. So if I'm taking my lemon peels, I'm peeling them, tossing them in sugar, and I'm letting them sit. What's happening? So I have oils within my zest that want to diffuse outward into the sugar because there's a high concentration of oils present, and then they're in a high concentration of sugar. The sugar will move into the citrus peels, the citrus oil will move out into the sugar, and after you let it sit, you'll have probably let it sit for overnight, several hours for sure. There's not really a way to speed up that process. You will actually have oil dissolved into your sugar. So that's an equilibrium based, where you have the particles moving back and forth. You're not applying kinetic energy, you're not applying any heat, you're not facilitating a movement, nor are you applying pressure. But you're able to get that kinetic energy of the molecules moving back and forth simply based off of a chemical equilibrium. So this can happen basically with anything. Like you can use your strawberries, as mentioned before, and tossing them in sugar. This is something that typically happens with maceration. You just toss them in and you'll have some strawberries and sugar, and some of the water molecules from within the strawberries will diffuse out into the sugar. Sugar will diffuse into the strawberry, and then ultimately you'll be left with a strawberry-based syrup. And ultimately afterwards, we think of kinetic energy, can increase through applications from outside the system. So we can literally just move the molecules. And the best example for this is a blender. You can actively move the molecules and you can get things moving and you can get them mixing. You can do this by hand mixing. You can do this through a blender. You can do it through your KitchenAid. You can apply kinetic energy in this way as well. Moving into the idea that I literally just vomited a whole bunch of physics and chemistry properties to you just to provide a foundation. But that's not necessarily what you're here for. You're not here to have honors chemistry. We're here to learn about how we use these things for behind the bar. So what does any of this have to do with us? Is it a waste of our time? But we need to also understand the nature of the materials. So when we're thinking of what this has to do with us, we can think of infusions and with syrup making, and we have to break that down by what's the nature of the material that we're using. When we're thinking of the nature of the material, like for example, if I have my basil, I'm going to take a different approach between using my basil and if I want to facilitate lemon, or if I want to use cucumber. The biggest thing is that when you're thinking of, I want to use something that has cinnamon or with watermelon or anything, any flavor you want to harness, you have to take a moment and think about what it is that I'm using. And I think the best perspective you can have is think about what is the water content of what I am using. Is it a spice? Does it have no water content? In which case, I'm going to want to apply a solvent to break that down and rehydrate. Does it have some sort of water content? Does it have a little bit like a basil leaf or like an herb? In which case, a process solution where I am tossing it in sugar probably won't work. I'll probably have to either apply heat to it, or I'm going to have to use kinetic energy in a blender to try and facilitate those flavors. Depending, is it something super juicy? Like, is it a watermelon, which has tons of water content, or is it a pear that's more fibrous? And so when we're thinking of the nature of the ingredient, we can then troubleshoot how we want to break it down, and how we can ultimately incorporate it into our ingredient. So I have a handy little chart right here, which kind of breaks down the water content in a lot of fruits and vegetables that we would traditionally use, where we see that strawberries and watermelon have the highest concentration of water. And we're moving down, we have things like grapes, which is slightly less. Apples are not even on this graph, they're all the way towards the bottom. And so when we're thinking of how we would make our sous-vide syrups with those ones, and we want to use these infusions, we have to troubleshoot and make adjustments for the lack of water or the increase of it. And so when we think of our infusions, so all of those infusions that you see on someone's back bar, which are actually macerations, all of those without heat are maceration. And so there are several ways for us to go about using maceration behind the bar. We can do cold process, and then when we want to think of the diffusion by heat or our infusions, we can sous vide them, or we can blend and clarify, because those last two are applying different elements of kinetic energy to them. From here, when we're thinking of our cold process, we can, and we want to use it with liquor, what we can do is we can just chop up our ingredients in our vanilla bean and we can mix it in with our alcohol and we'll just let it sit. The thing with this is that if we're using anything that is fresh, like our fresh strawberries or any of our fresh ingredients, it has the highest oxidation rate. When I'm thinking of oxygen, oxygen is kind of that like mean molecule that literally is constantly wanting to break things down. It can become inconsistent. There's typically a lot more browning or like a Maillard reaction that could possibly happen when you are leaving things in a cold process. When we're doing sous vide diffusion or infusions with liquor or bitters, they can be done in combination with a vac sealer. They're a lot faster, you're not going to get as many nuances of flavor, but if you're thinking of like bang for your buck and time, you can go for it. A lot of those, when we're thinking and rewinding back to our water content, when I'm trying to sous vide my infusions and bitters, if something has a higher water content, it typically takes a lot less time for diffusion to take place. If it has a lower water content or it's just a spice, it'll typically take a lot longer. And biggest thing is when you're applying heat for these sous vide infusions, you have to be aware of the temperature that you're cooking at. The biggest thing is that you don't want to actually cook your ingredients. When you want to sous vide and have them back sealed, you want to facilitate diffusion back and forth, but not denature your proteins, which means that you'd be cooking your fruit and changing your flavors. So I have my lovely little sous vide right here. When I have it running for a long period of time, I'll keep plastic wrap on it so the water will condense down and I don't have to worry about lowering water levels. They also have these like fancy little balls that you can throw on top, but I don't have time for that. So from here, I have several syrups that I have made. This one being watermelon that has tossed into with sugar. So we think the watermelon, they all have pretty much the same amount of sugar in them, but they have a higher yield of water. So we have this one. Moving forward, we have a little bit of blueberries. So we see that these were just, there was no added water present. We just had the blueberries and the fruit tossed in with sugar, and then we just let them cook. And these were done at about 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I typically keep everything under 60 degrees C, simply because I'm not trying to cook things, but I do want to facilitate those molecules moving. Another thing to note is whatever you're making, you want to make sure your fruits and your vegetables, if you're using fresh ingredients, you want to make sure that they're actually ripe. Because if you start making something and I want to infuse cantaloupe into it and my cantaloupe is rock hard, it's going to wind up tasting like squash. Like, it's not going to be the flavor that you want. Moving into the element of I want to diffuse flavors into my syrups, not my syrups, into my spirits. You can do the blend and clarify. So this is something where you can take your banana, you can throw it in your rum, or your pawpaw, throw it in your rum, you can blend it. And then through applying Pectinex, which dissolves cell walls, or through chitosan and ketosol, you can actually blend them and clarify them out in a centrifuge. I know the spin saw is pretty popular at the moment. Back in my day, we had to have gigantic centrifuges that cost like $10,000 or $15,000, and you had to hope that you didn't kill anybody with it because it was literally a time bomb. So you are all very blessed to be in the age of the spinzall for most culinary techniques. I just did things the old-fashioned way. Notes when I'm thinking about clarifying, I talked about Pectinex dissolving cell walls and allowing flavor molecules to go from inside something. If the cell wall's gone, now that water content, now all of those flavors and those sugars are just out in solution because there's no more barrier. And ultimately, all of those suspended solids from blending them up will now all sink to the bottom and get pushed down, and you can separate it off. Now, that was primarily when we were thinking about liquor. When we want to think about syrups, we all play with syrups behind the bar, whether it's a raspberry syrup for our Clover Club, or we're thinking of our ginger syrups. We can apply those same processes to our sugars, to our syrup making. Whether we can do the cold process, we can use the sous vide again, we can blend, and we can understand our error as well. So the cold process, and this is the most classic way to do it, and this is a classic maceration where it can take about 24 hours. We're taking our, in this case, strawberries again, we're tossing them in sugar, and the water content from the strawberries diffusing out into the sugar, and as it sits, the strawberries will slowly decrease in volume and they'll become more sugary and we'll have liquid left over, which will be our syrup. There are some issues with that, especially depending on the vessel that you're using. If you're doing this in a Cambro, you have a lot of sugar that can sit on the bottom and not get dissolved. I always like putting things in vac bags, though since I'm in New York at the moment, nobody has a vac sealer. You can always use little Ziploc bags. This is not trashy. It is very resourceful. And so what you can actually do is as you're using this, you'll have some sugar that's not dissolved, and you can actually just massage the bag and facilitate all of the sugar getting dissolved, and you can physically see what's not getting dissolved.
Dorothy, so I have this pet peeve around like making simple syrup and sugar, and everyone always cooks their simple syrup. And I keep telling them they don't have to do that.
No, don't cook it. It's stupid. You're breaking down.
Thank you. I'm just saying.
I have
like cook your simple syrup. I'm like, why are you cooking it? If the sugar just dissolves in the water with like gentle agitation, like what you just did, I saw, you just massage the bottom of the bag, and that's going to help the sugar. Yeah. Like just a little bit of like agitation will help just dissolve those solids. Can you just talk about that really quickly?
Oh, for sure. So if there's one thing I feel very strongly about, and any bartender that has worked with me can, it's understanding your Brix level and maintaining consistency. And so if I'm cooking my sugar syrup, whether it's a turbinado or a demerara, if I'm cooking it, I'm breaking down some of those sugar molecules. In addition, there is going to be evaporation. And so your sugar syrup or your simple syrup is going to be inconsistent from a Brix standpoint from one batch to the other. Like I can take my volume and the same mass, throw it in a pot, and then as I'm cooking it, you've got bubble, you have evaporation. From one batch to the next, there is going to be a variance of error. I personally blend that in a Vitamix like nobody's business. I take my equal volumes, I make sure I throw them in there, and I just blend it. I don't need to apply a bunch of heat to it. I'm not cooking it. I'm not breaking anything down. What I am ultimately doing is making sure that I have a consistent Brix level. And if I'm talking about Brix, there's the handy dandy little guy, which we have is like a refractometer.
How much do those cost, and where do you buy them?
You can get them on Amazon. If you go for the electronic guys, they're like $100. You can get these like cheap little ones, and I don't know, I feel like this was like somewhere between 20 and 50. I did not, that's a range.
It's okay. That's a good thing. It's not a $600 tool. It's not even really a $60 tool. It's something inexpensive that you can use to continue consistency in your program.
Yeah. And so when you're thinking of consistency, especially when you're thinking of your cold processed syrups, each fruit is going to be slightly different. And if I have a ratio of sugar to fruit and one fruit is juicier than the next, my Brix might be slightly off. And so what I typically try and do, I try and maximize the amount of like the water within the fruit that diffuses outward, and then I can strain it off and add more sugar if I need to. And so I traditionally use that using one of these handy dandy refractometers. I wonder if I can just show this into the light. Does this work?
Yeah.
Oh, it does. Awesome. Oh, whoa, that's a weird, well, anyway, there's typically a sliding scale. To test any of my syrups, I typically have a little dropper, which I have one here somewhere. Oh, got it. So I have a little dropper. These are also handy if you're doing like slushy drinks, because you want to make sure you have a constant Brix so that it freezes appropriately. You're typically just take your refractometer, put your syrup on there, and then you can physically just like look into it and shine it. Traditional like 1-to-1 simple syrups will have a range between 50, 2-to-1 will have one around 60, but you can check it out and be like, okay, that's the Brix that I want. This one currently has a Brix of like 55 because I eyeballed this simple syrup because I made it just for you. But I wonder if you can see this crap.
I don't think we can. Oh, actually, well, kind of, but not really. Yeah.
We'll give up on that, and if anyone has questions, I'll be like, yeah, I'll show you a photo. But anyway, you'll see a line as to where the sugar content is, and I primarily do this if I'm doing a fruit-based syrup, because Like, for example, this watermelon I used was super juicy. The watermelon I used last time may not have been as juicy, but I want to make sure I had the same content of sugar per watermelon juice water that contains all of those flavor molecules. So then if I find that that Brix is only 40, but I want it to be 50 to balance out my cocktail, I then can blend in the appropriate amount of water and do the math so that my sugar syrup that's infused with fruit tastes consistently from one batch to the next. Because the main thing is if you're doing these processed macerations or infusions with fruit is that, or anything, they can be rather inconsistent depending on what you're using. So I find the refractometer can sometimes cut through that because there's nothing worse than having slightly more sugar dissolved in less liquid, and so your syrup is super sweet and normally it's not quite. So you can troubleshoot that as well using a refractometer and then adding more sugar. Yep. Another troubleshooting method is a pH meter, where you can actually, it's like a small little thing and you dip it into a solution and it'll read your pH. This is great for making cordials. Like a traditional lemon has a pH of 2, vinegar is a pH of 3. If you want to make sure after you're doing your sugar syrup and you're making a shrub and you want to make sure your pH is consistent, you can use a pH meter and actually test it out. I got into doing that after working with Nico De Soto, and he's really big in acid adjusting different cordials and different juices. So I got in the handle of that because it made it a little bit easier. Cool. And so now we're going to talk about sous-vide syrups. So back when I was in Detroit, we vacuum sealed everything, and so there was a lot less oxidation. Now that I've been in New York and understand that nobody vac seals anything because it's too expensive, it still has a lot of the same perks.
Dorothy, can you actually, I'm so sorry to stop you. Can you talk about that? So like I'm in LA right now, there's a vac sealer in every kitchen.
Yeah.
When you say it's too expensive, what do you mean by that?
So it has to do with the health department primarily. And so a lot of places, when you're thinking of vac sealers, you can, if things aren't handled appropriately, like if I vac seal a meat and a steak that is at room temperature and crawling with bacteria, and I vac seal it and then try and cook it, you're creating an anaerobic environment, and it can wreak havoc and just create a bacteria-ridden mess that can like really mess somebody up and make them very, very sick or potentially kill them.
And anaerobic means like without oxygen, right? So it's a space without oxygen that bacteria flourishes in.
Yes.
So yeah, so there's some fear around that, and so the health department has some rules.
Yeah, so there's a lot of rules in place. Nifty thing is that like a lot of those rules have nothing to do with cocktail making. Like we are not sous vide shrimp. I am not using seafood, shellfish. I am not using any meat. I'm not using pork. I'm not using chicken. I mean, occasionally there's some weird fat washing, but like I'm not doing any of that in a sous vide. So a lot of those concerns don't necessarily pertain to cocktail applications, but there's a lot of rules in place. So if you're at like in New York, it's a very established market, and there's been the health department is based, not quite a cartel, but it's up there. Like it just, if you want to do something, you have to have the money behind it. So a lot of these smaller operations aren't going to fork out $10,000 to $20,000 for the licensing. And typically there's a lot of HACCP guidelines. So that's HCCAAP, I believe, where you have to like monitor temperature controls as you're vac sealing. So if there's a contamination issue, you can go back and check. The HACCP regulations are not difficult, but the licensing is expensive. A lot of places will either like have their vac sealer and just like tuck it away and it's hidden in a closet because they don't want to get in trouble for it. Other places just don't want to deal with the trouble because if you get caught with one, and you don't have the proper licensing, like that's like an automatic shutdown. Like that's really bad. Other areas where I find that, like Detroit was the Wild West, I like to call it, where you had a lot of like chefs that were like, well, I'm using this and there's no regulation on it, so I'm gonna do this, which I loved. Everyone had a vac sealer. Like as long as you purchased it, you were fine. The health department didn't really understand what it was, so it wasn't an issue. So there wasn't any licensing fee for having it, though if you wanted to make sure that you were fine, you would have like your HESUP guidelines and some temperature logs to be careful, which is great. So when we're talking about like cost effective of a vac sealer, I'm not talking about like those individual vac sealers that you would like vac seal your luncheon that your mom might have used to like save meat. I'm talking about these like big industrial monsters called a cryovac. I have one. I don't have one currently with me because like I'm in the middle of nowhere at the moment. But they're super handy. I love them. They are expensive. They are typically several $1,000s. But when people don't have access to them, like, for example, I learned after being spoiled in Detroit and having access to everything that you had to be slightly more resourceful. So if I was doing my sous-vide syrups, and this is just a small example, like this is blueberries tossed in a little bit of sugar. This is a Ziploc bag. What I do is I primarily just, if I have it open, I'll submerge it in water and push out any of the gas, and then put it so that the lip is right at the water level, and then seal it. It's not vacuum sealed, but it will serve its purpose in terms of getting a lot of these, like for this case, blueberries and the sugar, getting them in contact with the heated water so I can facilitate the diffusion in a less oxidative environment. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. And then when I'm thinking of, when I'm sous videing my syrups and I'm rewinding back to the water content and thinking of the nature of the ingredients, I don't apply the same exact amount of sugar to each element. If I'm doing a watermelon or a strawberry syrup, which is a higher water content, I'm using a higher concentration of water. If I am using something like an apple that is more fibrous and has less water content, I'm cutting that amount of sugar almost more than in half, because it's not going, I'm not going to have a higher yield of water diffusing outward. So an example would be like if I'm doing a watermelon syrup, which I did here, right? When I'm doing it by weight, I chopped up my watermelon, which was nice, fresh, super juicy. I weighed it out. For 1,000 grams of my watermelon, I did about 900 grams of sugar. If I'm doing apple, if I'm using 1,000 grams of apple that's diced up, I am using maybe like 500 grams of sugar, because there's a higher water content from one to the other. I'm not going to use the same amount of sugar for weight based off of one fruit to the next. So you're not going to do a 1-to-1 ratio like you would for a simple syrup, because not every fruit or everything that you're using is going to have the same concentration. And then from here, as I'm doing this, I talked about using the refractometer. You can check your sugar levels, and if you need to add more, you can add more to get to the level that you want. And the best thing about this, which we had to deal with Anne-Louise pet peeve, is that since I'm sous videing these in a closed environment, there's no evaporation in terms of the syrup. So the water that's getting released, even if it gets slightly heated or you have the sous vide set to a higher temperature, even if it evaporates out, it's in an enclosed container, it's going to condense and just fall back down. So it's kind of like its own little system, and there's nowhere for that water to get evaporated out to unless your container is accidentally open. So I'm a huge fan for it. In terms of sous videing syrups, the best part for me has to do with the fact that I don't like my syrups watered down. I like really high concentration. They're not oxidizing, so the flavor's remaining intact. For my example, this one's at 105 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of the proteins aren't denaturing, and all of my syrups I'm gonna make are gonna taste like I'm biting into a fresh piece of fruit, which when you're thinking of seasonality and the nature of your ingredients, if I can create the taste of biting into something fresh in the winter, and all I can do is take my syrup and I throw it in the freezer and then thaw it out in December, and they taste just as fresh, then that's golden. And that's kind of priceless because you don't have to deal with any oxidation or any aging. Yeah, I'm hugely into it.
So you would recommend, so you would make the syrup and then freeze it. So like during this, because it's strawberry season right now, you know, make all the strawberry syrup you can possibly do, and then put it in the freezer, and then just kind of pull it out as you're needing it.
Yeah, so I got this from Joe Robb of Standby. Him and I worked together for several years. He would, like during rhubarb season, he would just buy all the rhubarb he could, make as much rhubarb syrup so he could make a rhubarb cordial. Then he would take it, strain it all off. So I'm not talking about freezing it with the fruit in it. You're straining everything off, getting your Brix level where you want it to be. And then in his case, you'd vac seal it, but you would just like lay it flat and just throw it in the freezer. So they kind of just stacked on top of one another. And you could just have your syrups frozen for when you want them. And the best thing is that since the sugar concentration is so high, since there's no solids in it, because we're just talking about the water that's diffused outward, there's not really any you're not compromising the flavor in any way as well. I'm a huge fan for it. I think it's great. I mean, if you're in a place that's on a budget and you have the freezer space, like there's no need to waste stuff and be like, I have to use all my strawberry syrup before it goes bad. Just freeze it and have it ready for when you need it versus letting it go bad and get kind of gross. Yeah, huge fan for that one.
Nice, that's so smart.
Mm-hmm. It's great. A lot of people don't freeze enough stuff. I mean, we all work with ice, but you can freeze a lot of stuff. And if you've got a freezer, go for it. When we think of our blending techniques, we can blend to thicken, like using a milk syrup. But traditionally, when I talked about blending my simple syrup, which is great because there's like no evaporation and we're creating really consistent Brix levels. Another thing that we can do to facilitate diffusion is we can blend our herbs into our solutions and our simple syrups and make them really fast and quickly. I'm sure we've all had to make a mint syrup at one time or another, and it's like, oh crap, I need to make this simple syrup and like throw a bunch of mint leaves in there and like let it sit and hope it gets to a great concentration. I have my parents' handy dandy blender with me. It's not the best, but it'll be good. It's a rustic blender. So in these cases, you can take your herbs, and in this case, I have basil. There we go. Wish I was making a caprese salad with this. And then you take your syrup.
Hey, Leo, can you make her full screen right now? Is that possible, just to show her doing the demo? Or Dorothy, can you stop sharing your screen?
Oh, stop sharing. That's a smart idea.
I just think I want to see the demo like large.
Yep.
I think would be nice.
That should be happening right now. And then you'll be able to reshare, Dorothy, when you're ready.
Okay, sounds good. Am I good? Can you see it? The rustic blender. Great. So I just have basil, and in this case, it's a sugar syrup with a high concentration of water. I'm not doing anything fancy here. This is like probably a $15 blender. But you know, it makes me smoothies sometimes, so I'm fine with it. And so from here, you might think, oh, but you don't muddle because you don't want to brown your herbs. The fun thing is if you're using a blender, I mean, not necessarily this one, that has really sharp blades, you're going to be able to blend up and get a lot of motion going and creating like nice firm cuts so that you can create diffusion rapidly. This isn't an infusion because I'm not applying any heat, but it's kind of like blender-based diffusion. So from here, I'm just gonna chop it up.
So you added simple syrup to this?
Yeah, it's just simple syrup.
Okay.
And so as we see at the moment, it's like bright green. So that's a lot of the chlorophyll that's dissolved into the solution. As we can see right here, we still have a lot of my suspended solids at the top. So the basil leaves, through adding motion, we've allowed a lot of that chlorophyll and the water content in here that carries that flavor. We allowed it to diffuse outward into the solution. From here, I'm just gonna strain this off so we can see it without. The fun thing is when you're doing these syrups, it's super, super fast. It's really like beautiful color. You can see right here, it's like bright green. If you don't apply a stabilizer, like if you don't apply a stabilizer, it will oxidize and form brown. But if I'm making a syrup and I want to harness a lot of flavor, whether it's a mint syrup or a basil syrup, and I want it to happen rapidly, literally just blend it. Throw it in the blender. If I am going to use it with, if I don't need the color to look really beautiful and the brown color's fine, like I'll just let it oxidize. There are some suspended solids still in here, like as you can see, because I didn't strain it very finely. You can always use a super bag or you can clarify it out afterwards. But it smells really fresh. It's really delightful. As I talked about a stabilizer earlier, there is, if you're working with something green, you can use sodium metabisulfite, which is a food grade stabilizer, and it'll actually keep the color green and prevent it from going brown. Shout out to Luis Hernandez, who introduced me to that one. He's fantastic. But that's an example of a kinetic-based diffusion that we're using. As I'm straining out the solids, we can still see that there's a lot of green and a lot of that chlorophyll that was in the leaf has moved into our solution. You can also use this with alcohol. Punch was really awesome and they talked to me about it. And if you want to, we can reference that article later, but it was all about different blender techniques, and you can take your blender, and if I want to use my basil again or kale, I can blend it into my alcohol, blend it, strain it off, and have a diffused, it's not infused because I'm not applying any heat to it, a diffused liquor that has all of these really beautiful flavors. It will brown, but if you're using it for that day, who cares? It's gonna be bright green and delightful. I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen. Boop. All right, so that was a good example of a blend technique in how I literally made a basil syrup in front of you in like, I don't know, 15 seconds, and it was super fast, really easy. And if you're doing anything for some large scale events, it's really handy. Or if you just want a syrup on the fly, or you just want really intense flavors, do it. It's really great. The oxidation kind of sucks, but it tastes awesome, and I'm into it. All right. Okay, and so when we're thinking of our nature of our ingredients, we have to also recognize factors for error. And Anne-Louise was really great when she talked about her pet peeve in terms of boiling her simple syrup. And we want to think from a scientific standpoint. We want to know that we're always measuring by weight, because if I'm chopping up my fruit or if I'm chopping up my basil and I have 1 cup, is that empirical? Yeah, I'm not good with that. If I'm using so many milliliters of something versus another amount of milliliters, the weights could be entirely different. So I think the best bet is, if you're trying to troubleshoot and create a consistent cocktail program, is get a scale. Here. I have a couple right here. They don't need to be super precise. This one right here has been super handy and has lasted me 4 years. This one's good for just grams. If you're looking for something more precise, like if you're playing with additives, or if we're talking about pH adjusting your syrups or cordials, get something where you can measure tenths or hundredths. So this is like a more scientific scale. Like this is one that you would literally use in a high school demo. I think it actually is my mom's at her high school. But these are super handy. And if you get into the habit of weighing out your sugar or your different ratios, you're gonna have more consistency. And then bringing it back to Anne-Louise again, let's take in consideration evaporation. And so when we're doing that, we can play with our refractometers. We can sous vide our syrup so that the condensation is just going back in a closed loop. Another thing is if we want to work with our flavors, and we want it to be nice and fresh, we want to make sure we're not cooking it and pay attention to our temperatures. If I made my basil syrup and it was a steeping hot sugar syrup, like my cooked basil is that's not what you want. That's not the flavor that you wanted to go for. So make sure you're paying attention to your temperatures. Like my simple syrup in my kinetic diffusion syrup was cold to borderline room temperature. So I didn't have to worry about cooking my ingredients. And then even when I'm sous videing, I'm maintaining a temperature that's not going to cook what I'm using because I don't want cooked watermelon. That's not the flavor that I'm trying to create. And then ultimately take oxidation, which oxygen's all around us. Like I'm currently oxidizing at the moment. Make sure that you're creating something consistent and delightful. And I actually think that's it for me. And then I know we were talking about a cocktail, but I've been in a cocktail, what's the word? Not boycotting cocktails, but if I don't have to, I don't make one. So I just drink things neat. Cheers.
Cheers, that's great. You can drink things neat. I think there's a lot of uses for what you're saying for application with rum. I think especially within like tropical drinks, rum drinks, even being able to do like a pineapple simple and then do that in an old fashioned with the rum would be so delicious. Or like a coconut or something, like finding those flavors and then bringing them kind of in concentration and then being able to blend them with the rum. The rum brings rum loves fruit.
Yes.
And so there's so many ways that you can play with all of these things you're talking about with the rum.
Yes, absolutely. Like as you mentioned, the pineapple, like a pineapple syrup, making a pineapple old fashioned. Like I personally use like fresh vanilla bean and fresh spices, and I'll throw it in the sous vide and I'll have like a nice spice infused syrup. I'll use it for just about anything. Like a nice, sometimes I do like a homemade allspice or dram with my rum, kind of like sous videing a bunch of allspice. Yeah, it's kind of limitless, honestly.
This is so cool. Well, I was looking to see if we had any questions and I didn't see any. So I imagine people have a million questions, but they're probably like just absorbing everything and that they can reach out to you. How do we find you on the internet?
So I'm Sipping Science on Instagram and I'm only good at Instagram. So it's like Sipping Science Nerd. Got it.
Thank you so much for your time today and for going over this. This is so interesting and so fun. And hopefully now, like people will start calling it a maceration when they mean maceration and not infusion. Instead of this like colloquial, just being able to just call it an infusion for some reason. I don't know why people started doing that. So this has been really fun. And I appreciate your brain and your thoughts, and for giving us some really fun knowledge while also making us extremely jealous of wherever you are right now. What is that background? Are you like in the woods?
Yeah, so my parents have a house. Here we go. It's cute. As soon as New York got weird, I ditched it slightly and hung out here, and then I'm back in the city periodically.
Nice. Well, good. Well, please be safe, be careful, be well. Thank you for everything for today. And if people want to hit her up, it's at Sipping Science. This is Dorothy Elizabeth. I'm Anne-Louise. Please join us. We are programming on Tuesdays and Thursdays with Campari Academy in partnership with Portland Cocktail Week Distance Learning. But they have programs every day with incredible drink thinkers all across the industry every day. So we will see you back here on Tuesday, but there's a lot more fun to discover, and we wish you well. Thank you so much, Dorothy. Take care. Bye. Bye. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, everyone at Lush Life.
And the live stream is out. Thank you so much, guys.